Hello and welcome to Dice and Demons. I'm Emma, and in this video I'm going to show you how I paint Abraxia, Spear of the Everchosen, and her mount Thanatok. Games Workshop kindly sent me the box with this model included, and I thought it looked so cool, so I just had to paint it. So I start off with a model, as you can see, that's been primed using a white primer, and this one is White Scars from Citadel. And then I paint up all the skin and all the scales on the beastie using a color called Burnt Moss. It's one of the speed paints from the Army Painter, and it's sort of a nice greenish gray color that I think just gives a slightly warmer undertone than if you're just using black or an ordinary gray color. And once I have applied that, I just do a quick white dry brush over the entire model, and the whole idea is this is sort of a slap chop method. So the whole idea is if you do this, the next layer of colors, if you're using speed paints or contrast paints or something like that, then they will get an even more clear definition between light and shadow. Next up, I grabbed my Dark Oath skin color, one of the contrast paints from Citadel, and I use that for most of the skin on the beastie, except here, as you can see, for the claws, I've decided to paint them blue, and for the first layer of colors, I'm using Achillean green from Citadel. And I just do a really quick wet blend to make sure that the two colors mix sort of nicely. I'm going to touch up the transition later on, so it doesn't need to be perfect. It's more or less also just almost a roadmap for my painting later on, so I can see where I want the colors to go, and it's just a really nice quick way of doing that. Then I've decided that I want the scales to be both orange and pink, and I also want that to mix in really nicely with the skin color. So again, I'm using the Dark Oath flesh tone first, and then I'm applying the Gryph-hound orange, also a contrast paint from Citadel, and do a nice quick wet blend with these as well. When this is just the first layer of painting, and as I said, it's sort of a roadmap, I don't need it to be really precise or for the colors to be really smooth, because I can always fix that later on. This is just a way for me to know exactly where I'm going with this, and if I like the basic look before I spend too much time applying the details. Next up, I grab Volupus Pink, which is also a contrast paint, and I do a really quick wet blend between this and the Gryph-hound orange as well. I have decided that for the Dark Oath army that I want to paint up, that the two main colors are going to be sort of an orangey brown and then a turquoise color, because I think these two colors just work really well together. But for this model, which is a Slaves to Darkness model and is also a little bit more elite, I wanted a third color in the mix, and I mean, I'm always looking to include pink in my painting projects, so yeah, I just couldn't help it here. For the armor plates, I am going with Achillean green, again the contrast paint from Citadel. I wanted those to have a lot of painted texture on them, so that's why I didn't do the slap chop on those, because it would all be covered up anyways, so it didn't really make a lot of sense to spend time doing a nice cenithal beforehand. So I just painted them straight up from the pot with the Achillean green. Then for the skin tones on the beastie, I actually had a lot of trouble coming up with how I wanted to do this, or just getting up the courage to do this. So this model was standing for quite a few days looking just like this, because I was a little bit afraid to touch it, because I wasn't sure I could do it justice. So anyways, I eventually decided that I wanted to move on, and so I mixed up a color from Kimera called Dark Oxide with a bit of the Dark Oath contrast paint, and then I just did progressively lighter layers to do a sort of highlight. And this is the part of the painting process that I enjoy the least. I'm not that fond of painting skin, but I tried to do it sort of well enough without spending too much time on it, because both I had a little bit of a deadline that I didn't want to miss, and also because this is not the part of the model that I think is the most interesting, and the part of the model that I want to grab anybody's attention anyway, so it just needed to be sort of good enough. A lot of the skin has a texture almost like it's a scale, so I decided to underline that with a bit of the Achillean green once more, using that in all the crevices to make sure that you could really see the texture on the skin. both because I thought it would look fun and cool, and because it's nice that you're able to see that it's really sort of reptilian, but also because that would make it a little bit more easy for me to highlight. I could just do sort of small edge highlights for each individual square instead of trying to come up with a way of making it look nice and smooth over a bigger surface. So I won't say this is cheating, but it's definitely a way of making my life a little bit easier as a painter. Then it was time to start highlighting the scales, the part of the project I had been looking forward to the most. And for the first layer, I mixed up a bit of the dark oxide from Kimera, the color I mainly used on the skin, with some orange fire from Vallejo to make it sort of a relatively smooth transition between the skin and the orange scales. And then I did exactly as I did with the skin before. I just did a sort of edge highlight inside each individual square. Then for highlighting that, I used a color from Huge Miniatures, and this one is called Laser Orange, and I used that on top of the scales. This is it's a fluorescent color, and it's much more bright in real life, and it just means that this will glow under UV light, which I think is both a little bit silly but also quite fun. Then I do exactly the same for the pink scales, except of course, well, using pink colors. And the first color I'm using here is called Pulse Wave Pink, and it's also from Huge Miniatures. I try to be as careful as I can when painting stuff like this, because I don't really want to have to go back over the middle of the scales having to paint in the darker colors. And I also don't want to redo the dark line I have done between each individual scale like you saw I did for the skin. So I think this... I mean, you can never really help it. Sometimes you will have to go back and redo stuff, but I try to be as neat as I can here. Then for the second layer of highlight, I am using another color from Huge Miniatures, and this one is called Cyber Pink, and it's basically just a lighter version of the Pulse Wave Pink. And again, I'm trying only to touch the top of the scales with this color, and that's both because I think it adds visual interest that the scales don't look all the same throughout the entire scale, but also because it gives a sort of very stylized illusion of light and shadow. Then I decided that the orange scales were just a little bit too boring, and so I decided to go back in and add a touch of yellow at just some of the very tips of the scales, just to make sure that it was easy to see that these are actually orange and not just skin tones, and I think the yellow helped bring out that a little bit. And now it's time for painting the armor, another part of the project I've been looking forward to a lot. And I grabbed a black contrast paint. This one is called Black Legion. It doesn't really matter what kind of color you use for this, as long as it's easy to use and it will show up nice and clearly on top of the base color. And I try to draw in a sort of, I don't know if you can call it a graphic design or something almost. I think it looks a little bit like feathers. The whole idea is just to divide the armor plate into small manageable portions that you can then afterwards highlight individually. And I try to make sure that most of these shapes have a sort of a point pointing upwards so that you can do some really nice sharp highlights. But of course, it's not always easy to get exactly right, and it doesn't really need to be exactly right anyways, because it will be the overall look that will sell the look of the model and not each individual tiny shape. Then I start highlighting those with a color from Vallejo, and this one is called Aquamarine. And again, I try to be relatively neat here because I want the shapes to look really nice and sharp. I think if it looks too fussy, then the whole idea sort of falls flat. So you need to be relatively neat and then just highlight the outline of each shape. I don't touch the very bottom of the shape necessarily, because I think that adds a little bit more visual interest and also helps sell the idea that this could perhaps look a little bit like stained glass or something. For the next layer of highlights, I'm using two fluorescent colors from Huge Miniatures. One is called Blaster Blue and the other is called Gamma Green, and I mix those up into a nice vibrant turquoise color, and I use that, as you can see here, for the top of each shape. Again, I really like the sort of stylized look of light and shadow, and so that's why I'm only painting the top. You could do it in all sorts of other ways, and you wouldn't even have to use the exact same tone or hue of color for highlighting. You can really play around with it. And the reason I'm doing, well, it's not boring, but the slightly obvious choice of just, well, a lighter version of the base color is because I want this to match with the Dark Oath army, and I chose to go that route with them because, as I said, I really wanted the turquoise and the orangey brown look. So I'm using the exact same colors here that I used on my Dark Oath models. And lastly, because I want a color that really makes the design on the armor panels pop, I mix a bit of white paint with a fluorescent yellow color called Starfire Yellow, also from Huge Miniatures, into a very, very light and very cold yellow color, and I use that at the very tip of each little shape. Then, once I'm happy with that, I go back to the Black Legion contrast paint and I retrace my steps, meaning I try to paint in a black outline around each and every single shape here. And the reason I do that is because I really want it to look as nice and sharp as I can possibly make it, and I think this last step just really helps sell the stylized graphic look on the armor plates. Then for painting the feet, I used the exact same colors as I used on the armor plates, both because it was really convenient now that they were already mixed up on the wet palette, and also because I wanted it to tie in nicely together so you could see it was all one thing, and I thought it would be unnecessarily busy on an already somewhat busy model, and to go with a slightly different tone of blue. So I just tried to use a lot of sort of horizontal lines here because there is a little bit of texture on the feet themselves, and I just think it looks nice that you underline them, and I don't want them to look too smooth, and this makes it a lot easier for me to just highlight them relatively quickly. Again, I was painting to a deadline, and I also didn't want to spend ages trying to get everything really nice and smooth because I'm painting for an army and not for display, and I wanted to be able to replicate this type of color scheme across an entire army. So doing highlights with quick horizontal lines, I think, is a lot easier than getting really smooth blends across bigger surfaces. I also left in a lot of the darker color, as you can see, from the original Achillean green on top of the zenithal, just because I actually thought it looked quite nice that you had this quite stark contrast. It makes it look slightly cartoonish, but I don't really mind because the rest of the model is, quite cartoonish anyways. Next up, it was time to work on Abraxia herself, and her armor and skin are painted using the exact same methods that I used for the beast, so I'm not going to show that. I'm just going to show the cloak because it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for me to do a video showing you the exact same colors and techniques twice. So I have done the white priming, then with the burnt moss, and then the white dry brush first. And then I applied Volupus Pink, all again from Citadel, the same color I used on the scales on the beastie. And the Volupus Pink here looks really bad, and I think it's because my paint is getting a little bit old. So I just painted the cloak twice, and it really improved the look a lot. Then I grabbed Achillean green once more, and I used that to do diagonal lines called cross-hatching for illustrating where the shadows are on the cloak. I think this is both a fun and a little bit, again, stylized version of making lights and shadows, and I enjoy this way more than trying to apply a really neat glazing, for instance, over large flat surfaces. I also use the Achillean green to do a really broad edge highlight here, as you can see. And the reason I'm using Achillean green and not a black paint, for instance, is that I think it looks more saturated, which is a look I'm going for, than if I were to use, for instance, a black paint. Then for the first layer of highlight, I am using Warlock Purple from Vallejo, which is a nice, well, it says it's called purple, but I think it's actually slightly pink too. And the reason I'm using this color first before I go over it with the fluorescent colors is because the surfaces here are a bit bigger than on the scales. So to get some slightly more subtle transitions, I'm going to apply more colors to get from the shadows to the extreme highlights. I also use the same color to do an edge highlight along the edge of the cloak, and I tried to make it so that you can still see the darker, broader edge highlight just underneath it and behind it. And I think this just, again, makes it look slightly cartoonish, but also really helps you to be able to at a glance see where the edge of the cape is, which I think works really well for a model that you're going to be putting on a tabletop. So everything that makes it a little bit easier to read is always a plus in my book. Then for the next layer of highlights, I am using again the Pulse Wave Pink from Huge Miniatures. And I try to make sure that I put more of the highlights where I think approximately most light would be hitting the model. You could spend hours and hours trying to figure out exactly where the light would hit and how much would be in light and how much in shadow, and where you would have the really the most bright highlights. But this is, again, as I said, it's for tabletop, and I don't think that kind of painting is too much fun. So I just more or less go with my gut feeling and what I think will look fun. And if something would look unrealistic but fun, I am usually gonna go with the fun. So there was already a little bit of paint on my fingers, but you'll notice that they are a lot more pink now, and that's because I decided I wanted an even brighter, more saturated pink look, and the colors from Huge Miniatures just were a little bit too desaturated. So I mixed in a bit of a pure magenta fluorescent pigment with the fluorescent colors from Huge Miniatures, just to get an even more, well, even more bright color here. And it's really bright. If you see it in real life, it looks slightly dulled down in the camera, but yeah, very bright. I just thought her cape needed just that little bit extra. And then for the last layer of highlights, I'm again using the Cyber Pink that I also used on the scales. I also added to the edge highlight on the cloak with each progressive layer of highlight to make sure that it would match more or less what was actually going on the main part of the cloth itself. And here you can see the final result. I'm quite happy with it. I think it looks fun and bright, and I can't wait to put it on a tabletop and see how it works in game. And I'm quite happy also that I went with the brown skin tones, because I was really debating painting it gray instead, because I thought it would be a lot easier to get that to work. But on the other hand, it is standing already on a rock that I think would, I mean, it's easiest just to paint that gray as well. And also I wanted to tie it in with the rest of the Dark Oath army, and for that I think the brown skin tone just works the best. I went with the unhelmeted version of the head because I think she's got a nice evil looking face, and also because I wanted her skin tone to match with the beastie and also with the skin tone on my Dark Oath, just again to help tie them together as an army just that little bit more. And of course, since I painted a lot of this model with fluorescent paints, it will glow under UV light, and this is what it looks like. And I'm so happy with it. I think it just looks so much fun, and it's ridiculous, and it's not practical at all, and it is never going to be seen in a game or anything, but it just makes me happy. I also just wanted to show you how big this model is. So the rider herself is approximately the same height as an ordinary Dark Oath model, just slightly taller. And the beast is just a little bit smaller than I had imagined just from seeing it on the Warhammer page, and that's why I wanted to show you here how big it is, because I thought maybe it was going to be like one of the big dragons for the Stormcast, like Kruntus or whatever, and it's nowhere near that size. It is a big model and it's really cool, but it's just not, it's not a giant dragon. And now that I see it next to the Demon Prince here, I can't help thinking that, you know, adding some wings to this model might be quite nice. I don't know exactly how you would fit them in without obscuring the rider or something, but I mean, it looks like a dragon. It just doesn't have any wings, so you know, a small pair of wings wouldn't hurt. So that was what I wanted to show you today, but before you leave, I as always would like to take the opportunity to thank the wonderful people who support Dice and Demons over on Patreon, and if you would like to do the same, I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. It's really, really much appreciated. So thank you so much to Thomas Madsen, Gwenna L, Jordan Hollands, Queen's Wolf, Double J's Terrain, Mola Mola, Steve Eberle, Nassim Makaya, Andre Correa, Anthony Polcastro, Bosworthy Rogue, Mando Project, Starcon85, S. Beer, Economicus, Elliot Philby, Cyberfossil, Cinnamon Coffee 87, Terranery, Joshua and Anya Pavelsic, Charlie Robertson, and VT Knight 007. I really appreciate it, guys, so thank you so much. Also, if you want to stay up to date on my painting projects, you can do so over on X and on Instagram, where you can find me as Dyson Demons. If you have any sort of questions or suggestions for future videos, please leave that in the comment section and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!